Welcome to this video, the third in a series on land use, resources, and agriculture. Today we'll be talking about types of agriculture. Our learning targets today include comparing and contrasting subsistence and industrialized agriculture, analyzing challenges to increasing food production, explaining how scientific advances have led to increased food production, listing the pros and cons of antibiotic and hormone use in livestock, explaining the goals of GMOs, evaluating the environmental impacts of industrialized agriculture, and classifying sustainable agriculture practices. So we'll start out by talking about the process of industrialized versus subsistence agriculture. So a few things about industrialized agriculture. You can see the model diagram here up at the top, and it helps us understand that industrialized agriculture is really high input. In other words, it requires a lot of capital and energy inputs. It requires less land and less manual labor than traditional methods do. But it's highly dependent on fossil fuels to produce those high yields through monoculture cultivation, and it also encourages soil degradation, and pesticide resistance becomes common. On the other side of this, subsistence farming is utilized in many developing countries, and the cultivation method depends on the particular area and the characteristics of that area. So in some areas, you'll see things like shifting cultivation. In other areas, slash and burn agriculture, perhaps nomadic herding, intercropping, and polycultures. And traditional agriculture methods, such as subsistence farming, depend on labor, lots of land, and the farmer is really trying to produce enough food to feed his family, maybe a little bit of excess to buy some extra things that they might need. Some challenges to increasing food production. These are important because let's take a look at the bottom right corner diagram first. It tells us that in the year 2050, the world population will require 100% more food, 70% of which must come from efficiency improving technology. So in the U.S., we have over 300 million acres of prime farmland, and that includes farmland with different types of growing conditions, different availability of water, and different soil types. And we use that prime farmland to produce food, forage, fiber, and oilseed crops. Some of the challenges we face are a loss of farmland to urban and suburban sprawl, declining numbers of domesticated varieties of seeds, continuing to work to improve crop and livestock yields, the impacts of climate change, including droughts and floods, and agribusiness conglomerates that are replacing the old-fashioned family farms. So here in the top right corner, you can see a chart that shows us food production over time from the year 2000 up to about 2009. And each of the different colors represents a different area of the globe. But in general, you can see that that trend is a linear increasing trend in the amount of food that's being produced. There have been significant scientific advances since the 1940s in increasing crop yields. And those include the development and use of fertilizers and pesticides, and also selectively breeding to produce higher yield plant varieties. On this slide, we can see graphs for 4 different crops: rice, corn, wheat, and soybeans. The graphs run from the year 2000 through 2016. The blue lines are the production of that particular crop. The orange lines are the consumption of that particular crop. And then that gray trend line behind it with the axis on the right side is the stockpile of that particular crop. But you'll notice in all cases that there's been a slight increase since 2000 in the amount that's being both produced and consumed. And in particular, in the case of rice, there is little stock on hand. In the case of corn, wheat, and soybeans, there's a little bit more stock on hand. So we're making some progress in terms of increasing yield, but remember that we have a much larger population to feed. Likewise, in increasing livestock yields, 2 major advances have come in terms of hormones and antibiotics. we'll talk about hormones first. Hormones are used to promote faster growth of the animal, so bring that animal to market more quickly. U.S. and Canadian farmers use hormones. The EU restricts import of the meat that is grown with hormone use. They fear that hormones may affect child development and may promote cancer. However, the World Health Organization says that hormones found in beef are safe because there's a lower concentration than those found in normal human bodies. Antibiotics are used to improve livestock weight gain and to make sure that the livestock experience less disease. Now, antibiotic use, just as in humans, can lead to resistance to strains of bacteria. And in 2003, the World Health Organization recommended the elimination of routine antibiotic use in livestock. Genetically modified crops. So this is a hot button issue with a lot of people. And you can see in that top diagram the process, kind of 4 steps there, simplified for the production of a genetically modified variety of rice that produces beta-carotene. Now, the purpose of manipulating these genes is to produce desired traits. So in the case of golden rice, we're trying to add nutrition. Some GMOs are developed to be drought resistant, others resistant to heat, and still others resistant to pests. GMOs have really revolutionized agriculture and medicine, and many experts agree that genetically modified foods are safe to eat. Here are some of the typical GMOs produced in the U.S. So you can see in this graph cotton, sugar beets, soybeans, corn, canola, papayas, alfalfa, and summer squash. And the green bar is the percentage of the U.S. acreage of that particular crop that is using GM seeds. So for cotton, we're using 96% GM. For sugar beets, 95%. For soybeans, 93-94%. Corn, 93%. Canola, 90%. And lesser percentages for papaya, alfalfa, and summer squash. And as you see in the text on the left side, we are developing those GM crops for specific benefits. So cotton, we're looking for insect resistance and herbicide resistance. For sugar beets, herbicide resistance. For soybeans, herbicide resistance, and so on. Now, when we talk about herbicide resistant or herbicide tolerant, we're typically talking about some version of Roundup. And the insect resistant characteristics we're looking for are typically to be resistant to corn rootworm and the European corn borer. In this slide, we consider where the GMOs are and who controls them. So in the United States, the USDA approves the field release of genetically modified crops. However, the EPA is responsible for pest and pesticide resistant traits, and the FDA regulates crops destined for food, feed, and pharmaceuticals. So no one agency is responsible for regulating GM crops. But crops that are determined to not pose threats to the environment or to food safety gain a non-regulated status, and they're then approved for commercialization. Some interesting facts up here in the top diagram. 27% of Europeans are in favor of GM food. And we have, between the year 1996 and 2011, increased by 9,000% the number of acres of GM crops planted globally. So big increase there. Back to thinking about industrialized agriculture, there are definitely environmental impacts, and they fall into 4 different categories: land degradation, water issues, loss of biological diversity, and air pollution. We'll talk about each one individually. In terms of air pollution from industrialized agriculture, there is contamination of the air through pesticide spraying, whether it's airplane-based or ground-based, soil particles from wind erosion, odors from livestock factories, greenhouse gases from all that farm equipment that's burning fossil fuels, and other air pollutants from the combustion of fossil fuels. Some of the water issues include groundwater depletion from irrigation. This is particularly critical in the central parts of the United States and the Central Valley of California, pollution from fertilizer and pesticide runoff, sediment pollution from eroding soil particles, and then pollution from animal wastes and the enrichment of surface waters from runoff of fertilizer and livestock wastes. In terms of the loss of biological diversity, this is impacted by habitat fragmentation, by the use of monocultures, by stresses from water and air pollution, stresses from overuse of pesticides, and the replacement of many traditional crops and livestock varieties with just a few of them. Now, land degradation, that's soil erosion, accompanied loss of soil fertility, soil salination, pollution from pesticide residues, and waterlogged soils from improper irrigation. Turning to some sustainable agriculture practices that we can look at for the future. So if we work towards increased biological diversity in our crops and our livestock, we will enhance food security, we'll maximize the natural processes such as pest controls and pollination, and we can minimize the amounts of pesticide that we'll need to use. If we carefully manage our wetlands and our water resources, we'll protect those as well, and we'll see less of an impact on water resources. Enhancing soil health and minimizing erosion can be done through crop rotation, through conservation tillage, and through planting tracts of forests. There is a focus in sustainable agriculture practices on biological processes, though taking into account things like nutrient cycling, the effects of the application of fertilizers on crop growth, and predator-prey relationships. Also important to sustainable practices is to emphasize the entire agricultural ecosystem and not just a single crop. And we can improve soil fertilities by adding organic matter, managing the soil biology, and minimizing commercial inorganic fertilizer inputs. So I think we've covered the learning targets. Let's look back at them. I can compare and contrast subsistence and industrialized agriculture, analyzing challenges to increasing food production, explaining how scientific advances have led to increased food production, listing the pros and cons of antibiotic and hormone use in livestock, explaining the goals of using GMOs, evaluating the environmental impacts of industrialized agriculture, and finally classifying sustainable agriculture practices. Go ahead and take your mastery quiz, and I'll see you in class.